All right, welcome to today's Sharing Your Science Spotlight. Today we are looking at funding, and specifically funding with respect to the state of Kentucky and the impacts on research happening here. Today I am joined by KAS Executive Director Amanda Fuller, Cate Webb, who is a professor of chemistry at Western Kentucky University and who is also the executive chair of the statewide EPSCoR Jurisdictional Committee for the state of Kentucky. We are also joined by Eric Rouchka, a professor of biochemistry and molecular genetics at the University of Louisville and the director of KY INBRE. And so we've got a great panel for you guys today to talk about funding, and what's going on with funding is a broader topic, but also specifically what's going on with Kentucky funding and what does that mean for the research that happens here every single day in the state of Kentucky. So I will ask you, Cate, to go ahead and start. Tell us a little bit about what is EPSCoR and what do you do with EPSCoR?
Okay. EPSCoR is the established program to stimulate competitive research. And Kentucky is one of 28 states and territories that are established EPSCoR jurisdictions. And what has happened over the years, it started with the NSF and has moved to other agencies because traditionally, many of the EPSCoR jurisdictions receive very little federal funding. And you have to understand that EPSCoR has been going on for several decades. The attempt was made to systematically invest in EPSCoR jurisdictions to build research capacity. So it was not just putting money into jurisdictions. It was about supporting critical infrastructure, both in terms of physical infrastructure, instrumentation, but also human capital as well, to systematically build capacity in the jurisdictions. So NSF started a pilot program at the time that was called the experimental program to stimulate competitive research, but it is out now, the established program. And this has moved beyond just the National Science Foundation. It moved to the USDA, it moved to NASA, it moved to EPA, there's Department of Defense EPSCoR, there's Department of Energy EPSCoR. So there is a support from a broad federal agencies, again, to stimulate competitive research. So the idea is not just to provide funds just for the sake of providing funds, but to build up the foundation of research in the state and in the Commonwealth. And the equivalent for the NIH is what Eric is going to be speaking about in a little bit. The Jurisdictional Steering Committee, of which I am the executive chair, oversees EPSCoR efforts in a broad way across the state. And if matching is required for some of the EPSCoR programs, as it is in certain programs, then we navigate that matching funds with the state and the Cabinet for Economic Development. We also are responsible for developing the Kentucky Science and Technology Plan. That is one of our institutional responsibilities. Again, working with the Cabinet, working with the state government, working with a broad jurisdictional support across the state to develop a decade spanning science and technology plan, which ends in 2030, by the way. So I'm looking at having to do this effort again in the next 2 to 3 years.
Sounds like a pretty hefty undertaking, we'll put it that way. So Eric, can you tell us a little bit about KY INBRE and what does that stand for and what does it mean?
Sure. So as Cate mentioned, the IDEA program is NIH's equivalent. So it's not part of EPSCoR, but it is what is considered an EPSCoR-like program. So IDEA stands for Institutional Development Award. And it's similar to EPSCoR. This is an award that is intended to help those states that are at the lower end of NIH funding historically to build up infrastructure and research expertise, particularly in the biomedical research space. So the Kentucky INBRE, INBRE started in 2001, and INBRE stands for Idea Networks of Biomedical Research Excellence. And in addition to the INBREs, there are what are called COBREs, which are Centers of Biomedical Research Excellence, which are based at the research intensive institutions to really build up expertise in a particular area. So with the University of Louisville, for instance, it started with the Spinal Cord Injury Research Center, Diabetes and Obesity Research Center, and so on. But how the Idea Networks differs is that it's a statewide grant. Part of the motivation is to build research excellence not only at the research intensive institutions, but at the primary undergraduate institutions, or PUIs, which may have not historically had as much research for their students. And so the goals of this program are to build up that research expertise, to give students access and to research experiences, and to build the next generation of research expertise. And the way that we do this is mainly 60% of our funds that come in through NIH go out to the primary undergraduate institutions. And most of this is done through individual research awards. We have a development research project program, and we have a couple of mechanisms through that, as well as a summer undergraduate research experience. And then the remaining 40% stays at the University of Louisville and University of Kentucky to help support the administrative corps, as well as other research corps, which have historically been a genomics corps, have been a statistics corps, a bioinformatics corps, and right now in this current 5-year cycle is a data science corps.
Okay, so as you guys were introducing these different organizations, my mind started to wander, and I'm hoping that our listeners are also starting to wonder these things. So, we're talking about INBRE being, 2 decades, EPSCoR being, Cate mentioned, several decades. So, we're talking about, a lifetime, right? We've got college kids now who were born in the time that these organizations have been functioning. So, in terms of the impact on science here in the Commonwealth, what, if any, and I know I didn't ask you guys to pull any measurable data or anything like that, but just if you guys have any kind of broad impacts on what these organizations have done and these opportunities have done for the state of Kentucky, if you guys can kind of talk loosely about that.
I guess I can jump in terms of what the INBRE has been able to do. So over the lifetime of the award, we have brought in over $83 million in research funds. The current cycle is about $4 million in direct and indirect costs. And so that directly is coming into the state in terms of providing research dollars. And there was a recent study for the United for Medical Research that came out indicating that there's a return of about 2.5 times that money in terms of the economic impact on the state, directly impacting about 2,800 different jobs within the state over that time.
So we can testify in EPSCoR to very similar numbers, actually. Over the decades that EPSCoR has been funded in Kentucky, approximately $100 million in direct funding from the NSF has come in. As a result of that, the dollars that have been achieved from other external funding is at least 2.5 to 1. And there are approximately 2,000 jobs impacted. There are small businesses, high-tech businesses, thousands of undergraduates supported over the decades to expand their workforce development. But in many ways, it's very interesting because the INBRE also has brought in approximately $100 million in funding. So these two pillars have been extraordinarily impactful across the research capacity, across literally the entire state. The EPSCoR program, until very recently, was also a statewide program. And the current NSF EPSCoR Track 1, which is our primary, involves direct funding to 8 different institutions, in addition to our 8 different institutions, including UK and UL. And so a substantial amount of funding and capacity building goes into the smaller, less research intensive institutions. So I have seen what this does to institutions. When you walk into a program at the University of Northern Kentucky University or Western Kentucky University or Murray or Moorhead, you walk into instrumentation laboratories, undergraduate laboratories that students regularly use, and the equipment is cutting edge. And it isn't because the budgets at the individual institutions allow that to happen. That research capacity, that nuclear magnetic resonance instrument, that GC mass spec, that is almost always funded through an EPSCoR research grant or through a research grant that has its precedent or its antecedent funding and support from NSF EPSCoR or NASA EPSCoR or NIH INBRE. So the impact is almost unimaginable in terms of what the state would be like if EPSCoR or INBRE funding had not occurred on a regular basis. So you get first class undergraduate education and research opportunities at the smaller institutions, and that builds capacity across the entire state. And that means those students will go on to medical school or they will go on to research PhDs, and they are contributing to the future economic and quality of life across the state, because the drugs, the technologies that we depend on for our quality of life, they come from scientists doing that fundamental research. And I know that in the last decade, 99% of the drugs that were approved by the FDA were supported in its past at some point by the NIH or the NSF or some combination thereof. And we depend, that healthcare innovation, the scientific innovations that build the quality of our life and provide opportunities for our young students across the state, that comes from this type of funding. But it also comes from faculty who are willing to write those grants and willing to put the hard work into doing those grants with their students. So without those dedicated research scientists out there, none of this would be possible.
I think you've touched on a couple really interesting things there, both of you, as you're kind of explaining what your organizations do and the impact. I think the financial impact is one that's always kind of at the forefront of what people are hearing about. But what we don't necessarily hear about is that ripple effect. That $100 million that's coming into the state across different universities, where those undergraduates are now getting better equipment to work with, whether they're doing research or not. The undergraduates that are studying here in the state of Kentucky have a better educational experience because of the research that is able to happen at those universities, because they are able to stay and get a higher quality undergraduate education here in the state of Kentucky. They're staying here, they're spending here, they're living here, they're getting jobs here, they're starting families here. And all of that has an impact on the economic development of the state, on the technological development of the state, on the educational development of the state. And so I think it's really easy for these really complex things, these complex issues, to get really kind of convoluted and think, well, it's just money. It's not just money. It's money that comes in as an investment long term into the state of Kentucky and what the state of Kentucky grows and does and can contribute to the nation and the world as a population, as research, as technology. I think all of those things are really fed by these types of funding programs. And I see, Amanda, if you want to kind of share your thoughts and weigh in a little bit too.
You're muted, Amanda.
You're muted.
I was glad that Eric mentioned the United for Medical Research. That's a great place where people are keeping track of the impact, the impact of the research and the impact of the cuts. AAAS is another place that I've been going to keep track of some of the numbers, and they have numbers broken down on their dashboard. They have an R&D dashboard at the AAAS website, where they're keeping track state by state of how many dollars go into that state for research and how many human beings are supported by that federal funding. And that isn't only EPSCoR and INBRE funding, but it is, other funding that comes from federal agencies. And so there are just some impressive numbers there. In 2022, which was the most recent year that they have data for there, in higher education, Kentucky got $311,000 in federal research funding at the institutions of higher education. They have there from NSF some data saying that 3,144 researchers were federally supported, I think, in 2022. And there's also data there that 24% of jobs in Kentucky are STEM related. And I'm glad that Cate mentioned the science and technology plan, because there's so much in that plan about workforce development. And there's a wide recognition across the state and think across the nation that the jobs of the future, we're going to need a strong STEM workforce, and all these cuts are really cutting into our fundamental ability to develop that next generation of scientists, as both of our other panelists mentioned. So I would point people to that AAAS site, to the research and development dashboard, if you want to keep track. They're doing a really good job. And then United for Medical Research is also doing a really good job of keeping track of those numbers.
So we've kind of started to tiptoe into the cuts topic. So I wanted to start on a really positive note and share this, strong impact that the research is having in the state of Kentucky and what that innovation has looked like over the course of the decades that, INBRE and EPSCoR have been active in the state of Kentucky. Now I'm going to kind of switch gears just a little bit and tell us what you guys know about the impact of funded research in the state of Kentucky. What do we know about some of the cuts that are happening so far, especially with respect to Kentucky? It's important overall, but if you have some information or some insight with respect to what's going to happen or is already happening to the state of Kentucky. Eric, do you want to go ahead and start this one?
Yeah, so I can jump in terms of what we've been seeing from a biomedical research perspective. So we were lucky. Our next year of funding started on May 1st, and we did receive all of our funding as well as the indirect costs at our rate, which is right around 56%. So one of the things that has been discussed is changing the NIH indirect cost rate to around 15%. And so if that happens, there will be a lot of things that we're able to provide. Maybe it's additional students in a summer research program. Maybe it's hiring additional people for our cores, that if it goes down to 15%, we probably will not see any of that money back to us. Which currently for this year is about $600,000 that we get back to us as the indirect costs. So if that goes down to zero, then that means that $600,000 worth of projects and funding that we're not able to do. We haven't seen a large impact on the funding yet, at least directly related to the Kentucky INBRE. Where I have seen it at the University of Louisville is in a lot of training grants that perhaps have been geared towards underrepresented populations. And so now that means that the university is having to scramble, and students that have gotten funded for their graduate work that actually went through the process of peer review now have lost that funding. And so that means that there are going to be fewer students that are funded that will be able to push through PhD programs. And so that's where we've seen more of the funding being cut right now at the University of Louisville. There are also other areas, for instance, in dealing with HIV or dealing with vaccine studies. And so we have faculty here that have not necessarily lost their funding, but are worried about what that's going to mean in the future going forward for, looking at immunology and things that are very important for human health, and kind of the disregard for that. There are some, there's concerns. So for instance, the state legislature had put through a resolution attacking research of that involved animals, and NIH has recently added this to their grants as well. You don't get to human-funded research. You don't get to a drug directly. Basic research is very important process to be able to understand basic mechanisms before you can ever get to a translational step. And so the thought that we can cut out all basic research and go directly to translation is just not it's just not right. It's just not a proper way of thinking. You just don't go from 0 to 100. You have to make those steps and those discoveries along the way. And the argument is made that so many things that start out fail. Well, imagine if you don't have any of that basic research, there's going to be a lot more things that fail. There's going to be a lot more safety issues that would come up if you haven't done any of the work on animal models to begin with. So we've had to pivot a little bit in terms of some of the grants that we funded. So as Cate knows, we've sponsored a lot of projects at Western Kentucky in the psychological sciences department. And so they have research that's dealing with, for instance, with women's health. They're dealing with issues that dealing with workplace environments, or dealing with immigrant populations. And so those sorts of things, we have to be careful in what we fund with those. And in the past, we had student diversity research awards to help fund students that were underrepresented from NIH's definition, which is very broad, including first generation students that are from areas that don't have access to healthcare. So things like that maybe the general population doesn't really think of in terms of the diversity, and those have gone away. And so there are some things that we're no longer able to fund, and so that's how it's changed us more than funding dollars themselves to this point.
Cate, do you want to go ahead and share from EPSCoR's perspective?
I will look at this primarily from the NSF EPSCoR and NASA EPSCoR, because I'm more familiar with those numbers. The NSF funding, research funding, has sharply been impacted with the cuts that are coming in DC. And the area that has had the most impact is STEM education. Programs that involve work training grants, career grants, those are the ones that's seeing the most impact. In Kentucky, the EPSCoR, the primary EPSCoR research, that has continued to be funded. So we've received no cuts from our primary track 1. We've received continued funding in our new EPSCoR and eRISE funding. So the major grants are at this point stable. What we're seeing with smaller funding grants, And there's been a number of grants canceled in Kentucky from the National Science Foundation. What we see is that we might have a grant that has been completely funded for some time, and then all of a sudden the funding is gone. And we have commitments that we've made to students for training, and that funding is no longer there, and we're in the midst of a research project. So that funding still has to be met. And so we're scrambling a little bit, and I think institutions across the state are also scrambling to find alternative sources of funding so that this continues uninterrupted as we adapt to the new reality in DC. But it's an ever-changing environment. For instance, one of the primary programs that institutions use to improve major research instrumentation, the NSF Major Research Instrumentation solicitation has been suspended for this year. The NSF will no longer be accepting proposals. And in fact, anyone who's already submitted a proposal for the next cycle has had that returned without review. This is, again, for just a year, but is it a year or is it not? And what was frustrating about that is it wasn't generally announced until there was an office hour at NSF. I mean, so there's lots of changes going on at the NSF, and they're not being broadly communicated. I think the NIH, it's a little easier, but I'm not seeing that from the NSF quite yet. On the other hand, and I'm going to say this very clearly, and I'm glad of the opportunity, there is future worry. I see future worry on the part of the students. I see future worry on part of the faculty across the state. A year ago, I routinely told people this was one of the best funding environments I've ever seen for Kentucky over the decades. And while I cannot say that any longer this year, I can still say that Kentucky, we have broad support from the state government and from the state government agencies. I see many legislators who still value the what is clearly important for their constituents in terms of providing quality undergraduate education, that workforce development, continuing to bring in high-tech industries. I see commitment on the part of the state legislature. I see commitment on the part of the state government. That's all really positive. I see support for EPSCoR, the jurisdictions politically being very strong at the federal level, because the reality is that many of the EPSCoR jurisdictions are in red states. There is deep impact for EPSCoR, deep impact for ID, the IDEA's infrastructure across the entire EPSCoR jurisdictions. So I don't see that EPSCoR and IDEA are, as a group, are directly threatened. In fact, I would still say for Kentucky, we have a very positive funding environment. The EPSCoR, the eRISE, and the Track 1 provide support funding for the undergraduate institutions and PUIs across the state. That funding still exists. Those grant opportunities still exist. We want people to continue applying for those. And I don't want to, and I really do see that this is the funding uncertainty at the NSF, at other agencies, that's real. But it isn't going to continue in the sense that in 3 or 4 years, things will have settled down. You can't stop your research. You can't stop for 3 or 4 years and wait for things to settle down. You have to keep pushing forward. Yes, it probably is going to be more difficult to get funding in the next year or two. But that means that faculty are honing their skills, who are making every effort to go out there and get funding for their institution, for their students. When the funding opens up again, those faculty are going to be poised for almost immediate success. So my message to the state is, yes, there's lots of chaos right now. There is lots of uncertainty, but this is still a positive environment for moving forward in research in Kentucky. And we have many positive things that we can focus on, and you need to focus on the long-term picture. Research funding is a multiple year effort. It sometimes takes faculty 2 or 3 times, even under the best of circumstances, to get their research proposal and project honed to the point where it can get federal funding. That's just part of the process. This is a long-term commitment that you make when you first start putting research funding in. And what EPSCoR and INBRE do is we help faculty across the state bridge that gap, providing opportunities that are internal to the state through our EPSCoR programs, through our indirect cost rate. Those are what we are able to do. And that is actually my greatest concern about the IDC cut, is people look at that as somehow free money. It is not. It allows you to go out and expand the reach and capacity. And the truth is, research grants that come in, they have hidden costs. The building still has to function. The lab still has to function. The equipment, the basic equipment, is not provided as part of a research grant. You have to provide that for a faculty and maintain it. So these are real costs, and that IDC, they pay for those real costs.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. And I think I personally appreciate that, you have both addressed this as a challenge, but also as a way, to think about this as it feels like it is a bump in the road, but it is a bump in the road. It'll only become a sinkhole if we allow it to become a sinkhole. If we stop applying for funding, if we stop looking for research grants, if we stop doing research entirely. And I think there's that positive message that you just shared, Cate. I really appreciate. It did have me kind of wondering, is there anything that, we're talking about this as federal funding. Is there any sort of funding from the state of Kentucky? And how does the state of Kentucky, aside from these organizations, kind of respond to this to support, our institutions, our undergraduate research? Is there anything that's going on in the state of Kentucky that's kind of helping to support or bridge this gap until we, do see, brighter, sunnier days? Is there anything going on in that sense?
Well, NSF EPSCoR, NASA EPSCoR requires match. The NIH INBRE does not. And that match, actually, Kentucky has a really robust program and relationship with the state government and the Cabinet for Economic Development. And that match comes in from that direction. And so so from my perspective, the state has been very generous in supporting research capacity and research development. And a lot of the funding we send out to the or the NSF EPSCoR and NASA EPSCoR sends out to the PUIs actually comes from that matching source. And so the state legislature is behind that. And I'm always very cognizant that people don't realize that the legislature and the cabinet and the state government really do support what I would consider fundamental research and training opportunities for students.
Yeah, so as Cate mentioned, the IDEA program does not receive matching funding, but the INBRE, that's really part of the goal of the INBRE is to help bridge researchers to federal funding. And so we've been very successful in Kentucky, and our researchers at primary undergraduate institutions get funding at NIH through the R15 and R16 funding mechanisms. And in fact, we're at the top of the IDEA states in terms of the number of those awards funded. And so our goal is to help with that bridging to that funding. But even when they do receive that funding, it's not as much as an award would be at a research intensive institution. So we also provide opportunities for them to support postdocs past those initial awards, as well as providing some matching startup costs for new faculty as well that would be doing research in biomedical areas. So I think as long as the Kentucky INBRE is funded, hopefully that will help bridge what's likely to be more competitive process here in the next couple of years, and to keep research going on at these institutions.
I think this kind of also lends itself to a good segue into part of what the Kentucky Academy of Science does in our policy work. And so folks who are listening to this may or may not know that as a professional society of 5,000 members across the state of Kentucky, one of the things that Kentucky Academy of Science does is work regularly with our state legislators to communicate the importance of science and STEM education in the state of Kentucky. Because if we're not doing those sorts of fundamental, research projects, and we're just expecting a jump from, a very basic level understanding to a human test subject, it's almost like expecting a small child who has just learned to crawl to be able to hop on a bike and ride. And so that leap is something that, it is really important, as Eric mentioned, on the research side of things. But part of what we have to do to help our public and help our legislators understand why that's so important is to share those stories. And so part of what the Kentucky Academy of Science does on its policy side is really work closely with the legislation and communicate the importance of STEM education, the importance of quality research experiences for undergraduates, for our research institutions, from, the time that students take an interest in science. We have to really support it from K-12 all the way up through, through funding our research. It's really important for the state of Kentucky as a whole. And so part of what we're aiming to do with the Kentucky Academy of Sciences in that policy work is really share that and advocate for Kentucky science and STEM across the state. And also part of what we do in the communications side is really trying to share stories and put information like this out there to hopefully help educate our public and any legislators or, state employees, really just anybody across the state and beyond who's willing to give this a listen, to just share those stories and share information in a positive way, in a non-argumentative way. I think that's one thing that can happen so quickly in these types of discussions, when we're talking about funding, is we can quickly get, disagreeable. And I don't mean we as in the four of us, but just as a population as a whole. And one thing that I heard repeatedly out of our Kentucky legislators just this past session was we can disagree without being disagreeable. And so, we're facing this challenge together. We're facing this challenge from, multiple different perspectives. And what's so important is that we clearly communicate what we need. We clearly advocate for what we need, not just today, but as you all both mentioned, this is a multi-year issue. This is a multi-year outlook. So we're not just looking at funding today. We're looking at funding for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years. And so it's really important to kind of keep all of those perspectives, alive and well in these conversations. And I want to pass it over to Amanda to give her kind of last thoughts. And if you guys have any last thoughts to share as we wrap it up. But I do just want to say, on behalf of the Kentucky Academy of Science communications team, thank you guys for being here. And if you guys have any, kind of last thoughts to share, I'll invite you to share those.
Thank you. Yes, the policy work is important. I think Kate's right. There is strong recognition that we need workforce development. And so I would just invite folks listening to this, if you're a scientist in Kentucky and you want to share what you're doing with your decision makers, your policymakers, we would like to help you share those stories and build those relationships with folks who continue to support STEM education in Kentucky. I'm also just very grateful for all of the supportive communities that we have built over the years through these networks of INBRE and EPSCoR, but also the Kentucky Academy of Science, which has grown, to many thousands of people now. And so those networks are really the way that we can keep science going, keep researchers going, keep supporting each other, and finding, innovative and creative ways sometimes to continue the work that we do. So I would point people to kyscience.org if you want to find out more about policy work or about our scientific community in general in Kentucky. Also want to point folks, if you want to find out more about EPSCoR, it's kynsffepscor.uky.edu. Easy to find. And kyinbre.org is another great way to find out about the amazing work that's being done through both of those networks.
Okay. I always call funding efforts. It's the art and science of strategic persistence. So you think of it as a multiple year effort, it is, and you think strategically. It's not about submitting the same thing. It's about refining, looking for little pieces that you can improve. And that's where Kentucky INBRE and Kentucky EPSCoR provide those kind of opportunities for faculty to continue working on their ideas. I also want to point out that the Kentucky NSF EPSCoR Track 1, which is called CLIMBS, which is focused on resiliency and disaster science, they are having 2 documentaries based on CLIMBS so far, and they will be screened for the first time with a panel discussion on Friday morning on campus at the Gatton Student Center in Lexington on the UK campus. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk about EPSCoR. I think faculty, students, I realize that students don't always realize that they have been funded by EPSCoR. I don't think students always realize they have been funded by INBRE, but generations of students have, and we are starting to see that in our robust biotech industry, in our robust materials industry. I'm seeing that come back. Those people come back with advanced degrees, and wanting to pay back their community. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I would just close with saying that there's a lot of interesting and impactful science occurring throughout Kentucky. And that's not just at our research institutions, but the primary undergraduate institutions as well. And as we've found out in the last 6 months or so, that the science policy and outreach groups are going to be very important. And so I just encourage people to take advantage of opportunities such as the Kentucky Academy of Sciences. I know that at the University of Louisville, we have a student-run science policy and outreach group, and I'm sure that there are others throughout the state. And just keep apprised of what's happening, and let your legislatures know when there's something that you think is going to be very detrimental to is an impact on what we're able to do with science research.
Again, thank you all for being here and for sharing your knowledge and what you do and what each of these organizations do for the state of Kentucky. I think this has been a very positive and impactful conversation, and we just appreciate you being here with us.
Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.